There had been many messianic pretenders in the past, but never before had one man united the Jewish people of all lands in a movement so inspired with enthusiasm and hope. It is not to the person of Shabtai Tzvi that we must look for an explanation of this outpouring of emotion. Most Jews had never seen him and had little direct knowledge of him. Rather, we must look to the Jewish people themselves and see the movement as poignant testimony to their deep longing for an end to suffering, an end to 1,600 years of exile.
My good father-in-law left his home in Hameln, abandoned his house and lands and all his goodly furniture. He sent on to us in Hamburg 2 enormous casks packed with linens and with every manner of food that would keep. For the old man expected to sail any moment from Hamburg to the Holy Land.
No Jew attended to business. The shops were closed. People kept themselves in readiness for the moment when the Messiah would announce the end.
As commerce came to a halt, the authorities of the Ottoman Empire grew alarmed. They ordered Shabtai Tzvi arrested and gave him the choice of converting to Islam or dying. He chose to convert. He assumed the name Aziz Mehmed Effendi and accepted a government pension of 950 piastres a day. Shabtai Tzvi's betrayal seemed to mock the deepest hopes of the Jewish people.
Dear God and King, throughout the world thy servants and children rent themselves with repentance, prayer, and charity. For 2, yea, for 3 years thy beloved people Israel sat in labor, but there came forth naught but wind.
They had believed that a miracle would bring them back together as a nation, would redeem them from their scattered existence. When the miracle failed, there was nothing left but despair. In Poland, in the wake of physical ruin, there was now spiritual desolation. In the early 18th century, a man left his home in the Polish Ukraine and went into the mountains to meditate on the condition of his world. He was known as the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. The inspiration that he found would revitalize the Judaism of Eastern Europe through a movement known as Hasidism. Unlike the rabbis of his day, he believed that even a simple, unlearned man could approach God directly through prayer and worship. And in coming closer to God, a man could bring divine influence through himself into the world. Cleaving to God, it was called. It was a joyous, ecstatic experience, and the paths to it were many. Through prayer, through the keeping of any commandment, even through so simple an action as the tying of one's shoelaces. God was everywhere, and everywhere to be found. Followers of Hasidism appeared throughout Poland and Lithuania among the poor who felt that the traditional community had failed them. In the years following the death of the Baal Shem Tov, Hasidism became a way of life for tens of thousands. Many traditional rabbis saw the movement as a threat to their authority. Their reaction was swift.
Worthless and wanton men who call themselves Hasidim have deserted the Jewish group. They worship in a most insane fashion which does not conform to the religion of the Holy Torah.
It is said that a scholar once asked the Baal Shem Tov, "What of the rabbis who call your teachings false?"
The Baal Shem Tov answered, "There was a wedding festival in a house. The musicians played in a corner while the guests danced, and the house was filled with music and joy. A deaf man passed by outside the house. He looked in through the window and saw people whirling about the room. 'See how they throw themselves about,' he cried. The house is filled with madmen. For he could not hear the music to which they danced.
The spread of Hasidism was not to be stemmed. The Jews of Eastern Europe, weakened and demoralized, found in it the joy and hope they needed to continue. While in Eastern Europe, Jews were turning to Hasidism, in the West, Judaism would find a different direction. In the Netherlands, in England, and in France and Germany, the early 18th century saw unprecedented growth in trade and commerce, and with it a new attitude toward the Jews. In 1712, an item appeared in The Spectator, a respected English periodical.
The Jews are so disseminated through all the trading parts of the world that they are become the instruments by which the most distant nations converse with one another.
They are like the pegs and nails in a great building, which, though they are but little valued in themselves, are absolutely necessary to keep the whole frame together.
It is an irony of Jewish history that the very conditions from which the Jews suffered should prove to be a source of strength. Their dispersion had become a commercial network. The financial skills they had been forced to learn in the Middle Ages were now needed by capitalist Europe. In the German states, rulers turned to Jewish merchants for assistance, often putting the finances of state in the hands of their Jewish advisors. It was from these early Hofjuden, or court Jews, that there arose the great families of European Jewry, the Oppenheimers, the Wertheimers, and the Rothschilds. Wealth, influence, prestige, the rewards of the court were manifold for these Jews. They lived in elegant surroundings, rode in carriages with large retinues, and gave parties that even Christian nobles would attend. But spiritually and intellectually, they remained part of Jewish society, all but unaware of the changes that were transforming Western thought. For Europe was entering an age that would be known as the Enlightenment. Science had revolutionized the thinking of a generation, with startling discoveries in physics, in chemistry, and in mathematics. The Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, Hume, excited and optimistic, turned to examine human society with the reasoned techniques of science. They called for an end to all social oppression, an end to religious intolerance.
Warum entdecke ich mich auch nicht?
Why do I not disclose myself?
Mein Herr, Ihre Edel...
In 1754, in Germany, a play was published that created a storm of controversy.
Was nun? Ich bin ein Jude.
I am a Jew.
Ein Jude?
Ein Jude?
Grausamer Zufall.
The play was written by a Christian, the Enlightenment author, Gotthold Lessing, and his purpose was to show to his fellow Christians that a Jew could be wise, sophisticated, enlightened.
Was mir das Schicksal zu geben erlaubt. Die Freundschaft eines
The
Menschen
friendship of a man,
ist mir alle Zeit
whoever he may be,
unschätzbar gewesen.
has always been esteemed by me.
Ich schäme mich meines Verfahrens.
Nun komme ich erst von meinem Erstaunen wieder zu mir selber.
Sie sind ein Jude?
What? You are a Jew and have been bold enough to take an honest Christian into your service?
Sie hätten mir dienen sollen. So
You
wär's
ought to have
natürlich
served
recht
me.
gewesen.
That would have been right, according to the Bible.
Ihn mir die ganze Christenheit beleidigt.
The public was skeptical.
Drum hab ich nicht
Most
gewusst,
Christians
dass
could not
die
imagine such a man
ganze
coming from the isolated and traditional world of the German Jews.
Alfonsereien macht.
When accused of having conceived the impossible, a cultivated Jew, Lessing pointed to a young man he had just met, Moses Mendelssohn.
He really is a Jew. A man who, without any guidance, has achieved a great strength in languages, in mathematics, in philosophy, in poetry. I regard him as a future honor to this nation.
Mendelssohn, the son of a poor Torah scribe, astounded Christian society by becoming one of the foremost Enlightenment thinkers of Germany. His acceptance as an equal by enlightened Europeans was without precedent, and it indicated a path that other Jews might follow.
Adopt the mores and constitution of the country in which you find yourself. But be steadfast in upholding the religion of your fathers, too. Bear both burdens as well as you can.
He argued that only by opening their minds to non-Jewish knowledge could Jews leave the isolation of the ghetto. It was the beginning of the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, and those who embraced Haskalah believed that Western education was the way to a full and equal partnership with the Christians of Europe. We must remember that with all the talk of scientific rationalism and equality and enlightenment, the experience of the Jews had been one of separation. Separation had tried and preserved them. It was the source of their vitality. They had recently given birth to the Hasidic movement, which seemed to offer a way of spiritual fulfillment within exile. To give up their particular identity by merging it with the lives of the society around them seemed a frightening idea. After all, the Enlightenment principles of freedom and equality were still only principles, and Christian Europe carried with it a dark heritage of resentment towards the Jews. It was not until the end of the 18th century that these Enlightenment ideals were expressed in the politics of nations.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights.
The appetite for freedom that moved the American colonists now took hold in Europe.
Allons enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé.
In France, where Jews had been virtually excluded for centuries, the National Assembly issued a declaration.
All men are born and remain free and equal in rights. No person shall be molested for his opinions, even such as are religious.
There was the sense of a world on the threshold of a new age. The central political vision of the late 18th century was of a state in which religious differences would count for little, in which citizens would be equal before the law. Somehow ethical and moral traditions, which had been born thousands of years before, and visions of universal peace and social justice, which had been voiced by the Hebrew prophets, had survived to be taken up again with renewed spirit and enthusiasm. It seemed that at last the time had come when the Jewish people could join in fellowship with all others to work for the common good of humankind. the Ghetto of Venice. These walls stand today as a reminder of the long ages of Jewish isolation. For centuries in this city, as in other cities of Western Europe, Jews lived apart from their Christian neighbors. Ghetto walls and legal restrictions kept them separate. And Jewish traditions fostered a separate way of life. In the course of a single century, this way of life would change. The way of life of all men would change. The Jews would break free of their ghetto isolation and join in the creation of a modern world. At the end of the 18th century, two great revolutionary forces burst upon the European world. Revolutions in politics and in industry would drive and draw all of Europe through a century of dramatic change, the 19th century. In the closing years of the 18th century and the early years of the 19th, both shores of the English Channel were shaken by some of the most profound and convulsive forces in recorded history. The clearest manifestations of this upheaval were the Industrial Revolution, which had begun in England in about 1780, and the French Revolution, which began in 1789. Out of the turmoil of revolution, the Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity are shown as a beacon for all the world.
All men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The goal of all political association is to preserve those natural and inalienable rights.
It was a new political order. In 1790, the Jews of France asked to be accepted as citizens in the French Republic. For 2 years, the National Assembly debated. Could Jews and Christians overcome centuries of separation and join as equals? At last, in 1791, the National Assembly accepted the Jews as fellow citizens of the French nation. The French armies under Napoleon Bonaparte marched across Europe, carrying with them the ideals of the French Revolution. In country after country, in Italy, Germany, Austria, Hungary, medieval restrictions were swept aside and political rights were granted to all. For the first time, Jews were offered political equality and citizenship in these nations of Europe. But the Jews entered this new age with their own ancient sense of separate nationhood. For centuries, each Jewish child had learned that he was part of a separate nation. A nation whose history began in the pages of the Hebrew Bible. Many children today still learn the lessons which have endured over the centuries.
God said to Abraham, "You must leave your father's house, for you are going to become the father of a new people."
The spirit of nationhood had sustained the Jews, bound them together in adversity, and given meaning to their trials and sufferings. The prospect of citizenship in the nations of Europe raised a troubling question. Now that Jews were Frenchmen, Germans and Austrians, were they still a separate nation? And if they were not a separate nation, what did it mean to be Jewish? The answers would be found not only in the quiet of their own consciences, but in the turmoil of social and political events that lay ahead. In 1815, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. Reactionary rulers throughout Europe tried to undo what the French Revolution had done. But even as governments tried to restore the old ways of life, economic forces were transforming European society. Thomas Carlyle, the Scottish essayist, wrote,
"It is the age of machinery. The shuttle drops from the fingers of the weaver and falls into iron fingers that ply it faster. There is no end to machinery. Nothing can resist us."
Factories turned out new goods to satisfy the needs of a growing population. New wealth was created and a new social class, the industrial workers. Peasants and farmers flocked to the cities, some of them driven off the land, some of them attracted by the new opportunities of the industrial economy.